A stranger told me I look exactly like their missing sibling, and they were right. It changed my life. It started with a stranger's stare. I was walking home from work when I noticed a man watching me from across the street. At first, I thought he was just lost or confused, but then he crossed over, stopped in front of me, and said something I'll never forget. "You look exactly like my sister." That would have been strange enough, but what came next shook me to my core. She's been missing for 15 years. My walk home from work was always predictable. The same bookstore shelves to tidy up, the same customers who came in looking for their favorite titles. I enjoyed the quiet routine, the way the streetlights painted warm pools of light on the sidewalks as I made my way through town. The evenings felt like my own little bubble, separate from the noise of the world. That night, though, something felt different. Maybe it was the slight chill in the air, or the way the wind rustled through the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned the corner past the coffee shop, where I always stopped for tea on my days off. Its lights were dim, the closed sign dangling in the window. Just ahead was the bakery, its display of pastries replaced by shadowy silhouettes. And that's when I noticed him. A man stood across the street, barely visible under the flickering glow of a street lamp. At first, I didn't think much of it. People linger all the time, waiting for rides, checking their phones. But something about him made me uneasy. He wasn't moving, wasn't looking at his phone. He was just staring. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the discomfort. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just another person out for an evening stroll. But as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him cross the street. My heart began to race. He was walking directly toward me now, his footsteps deliberate but unhurried. My instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to avoid eye contact. But as he got closer, I couldn't help but glance up. His face was pale, his eyes dark and piercing, like he was searching for something, or someone. "Excuse me," he said, stopping just a few feet away. His voice was calm, but there was something about his tone that made my skin crawl. "I don't mean to bother you, but you look just like someone I used to know." I froze, clutching my bag a little tighter. There was something disarming about his tone, not threatening, but heavy with something I couldn't quite place. Curiosity, desperation, grief. "Someone you used to know?" I asked cautiously, taking a small step back. "Yes," he said, his voice softening. "My sister. She disappeared 15 years ago. I know it sounds crazy, but you look exactly like her." 15 years. My mind raced. That was before I was even a teenager. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "You must be mistaken. I don't have any siblings, and I've lived here my whole life." He shook his head, a faint sad smile crossing his lips. "I thought you'd say that. But it's not just the way you look, it's the way you walk, the way you carry yourself. It's uncanny." I didn't know what to say. People don't just disappear in a small town like ours, at least not that I'd ever heard. But his sincerity was unnerving. He wasn't trying to scare me. He genuinely believed I was connected to his missing sister. He reached into his coat pocket, and I instinctively tensed, but he only pulled out a photograph. "This is her," he said, holding it out to me. The girl in the picture couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old. She had the same dark hair, the same sharp features, and even the same small scar above her eyebrow that I had gotten from a tumble as a child. My breath caught in my throat. "It's a resemblance," I said, my voice trembling. "But it's not me." He nodded slowly as if he had expected my denial. "Maybe not, but you don't understand. We've been looking for her for years. My parents, private investigators, even the police. There was never a trace of her. And then I saw you." I wanted to brush it off as a coincidence, but something about the photo and his conviction struck a nerve. Memories from my childhood flashed through my mind. I'd always felt a strange distance from my parents, like there were pieces of my life that didn't quite fit together. They never talked much about when I was little, and any time I asked about my birth or early years, they'd deflect with vague answers. "Where did she disappear from?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated. "Not far from here. A small town, about an hour away. One day she was playing in the backyard, and the next, she was gone. No leads, no suspects, nothing." The air seemed heavier as his words hung between us. If what he was saying was true, then could it really just be a coincidence? That night, I couldn't sleep. The man's words replayed in my head, over and over. You look exactly like her. And that photograph, it wasn't just a resemblance. It was like looking at a younger version of myself. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But the doubt gnawed at me. There were too many unanswered questions about my childhood. My parents had always been loving, but vague when it came to specifics. They avoided stories about my early years, brushing off questions with phrases like, "It doesn't matter now," or "We're just happy you're here." The next day I decided I couldn't let it go. If this was just a misunderstanding, I needed to prove it to myself. I pulled out a box of old family photos, ones my mom kept tucked away in a closet. They were mostly of birthdays, holidays, and random moments captured on film. But as I flipped through them, something struck me as odd. There were no photos of me as a baby, not one. The earliest picture I could find was from my 5th birthday. I was standing next to a cake, wearing a party hat that was slightly too big, grinning from ear to ear. But even that felt strange. The room in the background wasn't our house. It was unfamiliar, like we'd just moved in. I confronted my mom that evening. "Why don't we have any pictures of me as a baby?" I asked casually, trying not to sound accusatory. She stiffened, her smile faltering. "Oh, you know how it was back then," she said, waving a hand. "We didn't have phones with cameras, and your dad wasn't great about taking photos. It's nothing to worry about." Her answer felt rehearsed. "But we have baby pictures of other relatives," I pressed. "Why not me?" Her expression shifted, just for a moment. But it was enough. I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear. "It's not a big deal, honey," she said, turning away. "Now, help me set the table." That night, I decided to dig deeper. If my parents wouldn't give me answers, I'd find them myself. I remembered the man had mentioned the town where his sister disappeared. The name stuck in my mind. Brookhaven. I searched online, combing through old news archives and forums, looking for anything about a missing girl. It took hours, but eventually I found an article. The headline read, "Local girl missing, search continues." The date was from 15 years ago, and the girl's name was Emily Harper. The photo accompanying the article was the same one the man had shown me. My stomach twisted. The article detailed her disappearance, how she'd vanished without a trace, leaving her family devastated. But what sent chills down my spine was a description from one of the neighbors, recalling the day she went missing. There was a black van parked near the house. No one recognized it, and it was gone by the time anyone realized Emily was missing. A black van. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I remembered seeing a black van in one of my earliest memories. Faint and fragmented, like a dream I couldn't quite piece together. The next morning, I couldn't hold back any longer. I sat my parents down at the kitchen table, my heart pounding in my chest. I laid out the article about Emily Harper and the photo of the black van, sliding them across the table toward my mom. "Can you explain this?" I asked, my voice trembling. My mom glanced at the article, her face draining of color. She didn't say a word. My dad, sitting beside her, furrowed his brow. "What is this? And why are you bringing it to us?" "Because there's something you're not telling me," I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why don't we have baby pictures of me? Why do I remember seeing a black van like the one in this story? And why does a stranger think I'm his missing sister?" My mom finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have gone digging." The room went silent, the weight of her words suffocating. My dad reached for her hand, but she pulled away, standing abruptly. "We did what we had to," she said, pacing the room. "We wanted to protect you." "Protect me from what?" I demanded. She turned to face me, tears brimming in her eyes. "Emily Harper, she was you. We found you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean you found me?" My dad stepped in, his voice steady but strained. 15 years ago, your mother and I were driving through Brookhaven. We were going through a rough time, trying to start a family, and we thought a change of scenery might help. We stopped at a rest area, and that's when we saw you. You were alone, crying, with no one in sight. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "You're saying you took me?" "We didn't take you," my mom said quickly. "We waited. We stayed there for hours, but no one came back for you. There was no black van, no sign of anyone looking for you. We were afraid something terrible had happened, so we brought you home." "And you didn't think to call the police?" I shot back, my voice rising. "We did," my dad said. "We reported finding you, but no one followed up. And when we saw the news about a missing girl, we panicked. We couldn't risk losing you. We'd already fallen in love with you." My head spun. Their story didn't make sense. If they had taken me in with good intentions, why hadn't they come forward when the search for Emily Harper was in full swing? And why did I remember flashes of that black van and the feeling of being carried away? I looked at them both, the people I had loved and trusted my entire life, and I felt like I didn't know them at all. I left the house without another word, my parents' voices echoing behind me as I slammed the door. I needed air, space, anything to clear my head. But more than that, I needed answers. Answers they couldn't or wouldn't give me. The article mentioned the Harpers still lived in Brookhaven. After pacing my room for what felt like hours, I made a decision. I was going to find them. The drive to Brookhaven felt surreal. It was only an hour away, yet I had never been there, or at least, not that I remembered. The town was small, its streets lined with quaint shops and old houses, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. I found the Harper residence easily enough. Their house was modest, with a well-kept lawn and a porch swing that creaked in the breeze. My heart raced as I walked up the steps, unsure of what I was about to do. What could I even say? "Hi, I think I might be your missing daughter." The thought alone made my stomach churn. I hesitated before knocking, but before I could change my mind, the door opened. A woman in her late 50s stood there, her hair streaked with gray and her eyes tired but kind. She froze when she saw me, her hand flying to her mouth. "Emily?" she whispered. Her reaction sent a jolt through me. "No, I'm not Emily," I stammered, "but I think we need to talk." She invited me in, her hands trembling as she gestured toward the couch. Her husband joined us shortly after, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. I explained everything, the stranger on the street, the letter, my parents' confession. Every word felt heavier than the last. When I finished, there was silence. The woman, my possible mother, finally spoke. "We never stopped looking for you," she said, her voice breaking. "For 15 years, we've prayed for a miracle." Her husband nodded. "But how do we know for sure?" he asked gently. "We need to be certain." They suggested a DNA test. I agreed, knowing it was the only way to confirm the truth. They called a lab that could expedite the process, and within hours, I found myself sitting in a sterile room as a technician swabbed my cheek. As I waited for the results, I couldn't help but notice the framed photos lining the walls of the Harpers' home. Pictures of Emily as a child, her smile wide and carefree, pictures of a life that might have been mine. But something felt off. The warmth of their home didn't match the flashes of memory I had. The cold air, the black van, the sound of a door slamming. If they were my real family, why didn't it feel right? The waiting was excruciating. The Harpers tried to make small talk, offering tea and snacks, but none of us could focus. Their hands fidgeted, their eyes constantly flickering toward the clock. I sat stiffly on the edge of their couch, staring at the framed photo of Emily on the mantel. The resemblance was undeniable, but was it enough? Finally, the call came. The lab technician's voice was calm, but firm. "The results are in. There's a 99.9% match. This young woman is biologically related to the Harpers." My world tilted. The Harpers' faces crumpled with emotion. Mrs. Harper, my mother, burst into tears, clutching me like she'd never let go again. Mr. Harper hugged us both. His voice choked as he whispered, "We found you. After all these years, we found you." I should have felt something, relief, joy, closure, but all I felt was confusion. The DNA confirmed their story, but my memories didn't align with theirs. The black van, the fear, the fragments of a life before them. None of it fit. That night, I stayed in the Harpers' guest room. My supposed mother couldn't stop smiling, showing me old photo albums, pointing out Emily's favorite toys, her favorite foods, her laugh. She was trying to reconnect, to fill in the years we'd lost. But something inside me resisted. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like a stranger in their home. Around midnight, I crept downstairs, needing space to clear my head. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet. I found myself drawn to a small study tucked away near the back of the house. Inside was a desk covered in papers and an old filing cabinet. It wasn't intentional. I just wanted to sit and think. But when I leaned against the desk, a drawer slid open, revealing a stack of old documents. My eyes caught a familiar word on the top page. Adoption agreement. I froze, my heart pounding. Adoption? What did that mean? I pulled out the papers, scanning the text. The agreement dated back to shortly after Emily had disappeared, but something didn't make sense. The Harpers had apparently applied to adopt another child, a replacement for their missing daughter. A chill ran through me. If they'd adopted a child, then who was I? And why hadn't they told me? Suddenly I heard a floorboard creak behind me. I turned to see Mrs. Harper standing in the doorway, her face pale. "You weren't supposed to see that," she said quietly. Mrs. Harper stood frozen in the doorway, her hands trembling as she gripped the frame. The warmth and joy she'd shown earlier were gone, replaced by something colder, darker. My throat tightened as I clutched the adoption papers. "You lied to me?" I said, my voice shaking. "You said you'd been looking for me all these years, but you adopted someone else? Why didn't you tell me?" She stepped into the room, her expression unreadable. "It wasn't supposed to matter," she whispered. "You're home now, and that's all that matters." "But it does matter," I snapped, my voice rising. "Why didn't you tell me? What aren't you saying?" Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment I thought she might break. But then her gaze hardened. "Because you're not supposed to remember," she said flatly. "We were so close to making it right." I felt the air leave my lungs. "What do you mean, making it right?" I asked, backing away from her. Before she could answer, Mr. Harper appeared in the doorway, his face lined with worry. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes darting between us. When he saw the papers in my hand, his expression darkened. "You shouldn't have been snooping." "I wasn't snooping," I shot back. "I found these by accident, but now I want answers. Who am I? What really happened to Emily?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched so long, it felt unbearable. Finally, Mrs. Harper spoke, her voice low and measured. "You are Emily, but not the way you think." Her words hit me like a physical blow. "What does that even mean?" I demanded. Mr. Harper stepped forward, his voice strained. "You're the same person, but not entirely. When Emily disappeared, something happened to her. To you. We don't know exactly how, but we found you again under unusual circumstances." "What circumstances?" I pressed. They exchanged a glance, and I could see the tension in their eyes. Finally, Mrs. Harper sighed. "The van you remember, it wasn't taking you, it was bringing you back." I stumbled backward, my head spinning. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated before continuing. "After you disappeared, we thought we'd never see you again. Then, one night, the van showed up. It left you in the backyard, unconscious. But you weren't the same." "What do you mean?" I whispered, dread pooling in my stomach. "You didn't remember us. You didn't remember anything. And there were other changes. You weren't quite right. We didn't know what to do, so we tried to start over, to help you heal. But you're remembering now, aren't you?" Her words sent chills through me. I wanted to run, to leave and never look back, but I couldn't move. Memories began surfacing, fragmented and unclear. Cold hands, bright lights, voices I didn't recognize, and the black van, always the black van. "I don't understand," I said weakly. "What did they do to me?" "We don't know," Mr. Harper admitted. "But we do know one thing. Whoever brought you back, they might come for you again." My legs gave out, and I sank into the chair behind me. The words swirled in my head, but they didn't make sense. "You're Emily, but not entirely. Whoever brought you back might come for you again." "What are you saying?" I demanded, my voice barely a whisper. "That I was taken, changed? By who? For what?" Mrs. Harper knelt in front of me, her hands trembling as she placed them on mine. "We don't know. We've tried to figure it out for years, but the people who brought you back, they didn't leave any trace, just the van, no plates, no driver, nothing. And you didn't speak for weeks after we found you. It was like you weren't really there." I yanked my hands away, standing abruptly. "So, you lied to me my whole life? Pretended everything was fine while you knew something like this happened to me?" "It wasn't like that," Mr. Harper said quickly, stepping closer. We wanted to protect you. We thought if we gave you a normal life, if we didn't talk about it, you might heal. We thought whatever happened was behind us. Behind us, I repeated, anger surging through me. You knew I wasn't safe. You knew there were people, things out there, and you still kept this from me. We didn't know what else to do, Mrs. Harper cried, tears streaming down her face. And we were scared, Emily, for you, for us. We thought we were doing the right thing. The room felt stifling, the weight of their words crushing me. Memories continued to flash in my mind, flashes of light, shadowy figures, and that unshakable hum of the van's engine. My chest tightened as something deeper, darker bubbled to the surface. A voice, faint and mechanical, repeating the same phrase over and over. Subject unstable, begin protocols. I stumbled backward, gasping for air. I remember something, a voice. It kept saying, subject unstable. What does that mean? Mrs. Harper paled. You weren't normal when you came back, she whispered. Your health was fragile, your behavior unpredictable. We tried to get you help, but nothing worked. Then one day, you started acting like yourself again, and we thought, maybe it was over. Maybe what was over? I demanded. Mr. Harper spoke this time, his voice grim. The seizures, the fainting, the times you'd wake up screaming in a language we didn't recognize. Emily, we think whoever took you, they did something to you, and now it might be waking up again. The air seemed to vanish from the room. My heart pounded as their words sank in. Whoever took you, waking up again. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to pretend this was some kind of elaborate lie or misunderstanding, but deep down, I knew they were telling the truth. I need to leave, I said suddenly, stepping toward the door. Emily, please don't go, Mrs. Harper begged. We can figure this out together. No, I said firmly. You've had 15 years to tell me the truth, and you didn't. I need to figure this out on my own. I grabbed my coat and stormed out, their pleas echoing behind me. As I stepped into the cold night air, I felt a strange sensation, a low hum vibrating through my chest. I froze, looking around, but the street was empty. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A black van parked just a few houses away, its engine idling softly. I froze, staring at the black van. The engine's low hum resonated in my chest, sending a chill down my spine. Memories I didn't fully understand clawed their way to the surface. Flashes of bright lights, muffled voices, the cold touch of metal. I knew I should turn around, walk away, and never look back. But something inside me wouldn't let go. This was my chance to find answers. I slipped into the shadows, keeping my distance as I followed the van. It moved slowly, its taillights glowing faintly in the darkness. My heart pounded as I trailed it through the quiet streets of Brookhaven, careful to stay out of sight. The van didn't take the main road, but instead veered onto a narrow dirt path that cut through the woods. My stomach churned as I realized where it was heading. The woods had always been a place of unease for me, even as a child. My parents, no, the Harpers, had always warned me to stay away. Now I wondered if they had a reason. The van stopped in a clearing, its headlights cutting through the dense trees. I crouched behind a large oak, peering out as the driver's door opened. A tall figure stepped out, their face obscured by the shadows. They moved to the back of the van, pulling something out. A heavy metal case, its surface glinting in the moonlight. The figure turned toward the woods, carrying the case as they disappeared into the trees. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but my feet refused to move. I waited until the figure was out of sight before creeping closer to the van. The back doors were slightly ajar, and inside, I saw rows of equipment, monitors, cables, and strange devices that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. And then I saw it, a folder labeled with a single word. Subjects. My hands shook as I reached for the folder, flipping it open. Inside were pages of detailed notes, each one listing a name, a date, and a series of cryptic observations. Most of the names were unfamiliar, but then I saw it. Emily Harper. The notes beside my name made my blood run cold. Subject unstable. Initial memory wipe successful, but partial recovery detected. Observation recommended. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. They had been watching me. All these years, they had known where I was, what I was doing. And now, they were back. Before I could process what I'd just read, a voice spoke behind me. You shouldn't be here. I spun around, the folder clutched to my chest. The figure from the woods stood just a few feet away, their face still obscured. My heart pounded as they stepped closer, their movements deliberate and calm. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," they said, their voice cold and mechanical. "Come with us, and we'll explain everything." I took a step back, shaking my head. "Number? You took me once. You're not taking me again." They sighed, almost as if they pitied me. "You don't have a choice." I clenched the folder against my chest, my mind racing. The figure stood motionless, their silhouette blending into the shadows of the trees. The mechanical coldness in their voice sent shivers down my spine. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling but defiant. "We don't want anything," they replied. "We're here to correct an anomaly. You should never have been returned." Their words hit me like a slap. "Returned? What does that mean? Who are you? What did you do to me?" The figure hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, they stepped closer, just enough for the moonlight to catch their features. Their face was expressionless, but their eyes, they glowed faintly, a dull, unnatural light that made my stomach churn. "You were part of a program," they said, their tone flat. "An experiment designed to advance human potential. The Harper family was chosen because they lived in an area where our operations could remain undetected. Emily Harper was a viable subject." "Viable for what?" I asked, my voice cracking. They tilted their heads slightly as if my question amused them. "Enhancement, integration, evolution, but you were unstable. The process failed and you were discarded. We never intended for you to survive." The words didn't feel real. I shook my head, backing away. "You're lying. You're just trying to scare me." "Am I?" they replied, their glowing eyes narrowing. "Think about your memories, the flashes you can't explain, the voice you hear, the sensations you feel. That's not fear. It's the truth trying to surface." Images flooded my mind. The black van, the cold lights, the voice repeating the same phrase over and over. "Subject unstable. Begin protocols." My knees buckled, and I sank to the ground, clutching my head. "What do you want from me?" I whispered again, this time barely audible. "To finish what we started," they said simply. "You've already begun to destabilize. If you don't let us complete the process, the results will be catastrophic for you and everyone around you." My breathing quickened as I looked up at them. "And if I refuse?" Their expression didn't change. "Then you'll be left to deteriorate. But know this, you're not the only one. The program continues. Others have been chosen. Others." My heart sank as I thought about what that meant. More families torn apart, more children used and discarded like experiments. I couldn't let it happen. I wouldn't. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I stood, gripping the folder tightly. "You're not taking me anywhere," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "And I'll make sure no one else has to go through this." The figure sighed, almost like they pitied me. "You can't stop us," they said. "But you can save yourself. This is your final chance." I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the dirt path as the figure's voice called out behind me, eerily calm. "You can't run forever, Emily. We'll find you." The cold air burned my lungs as I sprinted through the woods, the sound of my pounding footsteps blending with the rustling leaves. I didn't stop until I reached the road, the black van shrinking into the distance behind me. My heart raced, my mind spinning with everything I had just learned. I wasn't just someone's missing daughter. I wasn't just a person with gaps in her memory. I was something else, something created, experimented on, and discarded like a failed prototype. But despite their claim that I was unstable, I had survived, and that gave me an edge. I climbed into my car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. My hands still trembled, but my thoughts were clearer now. I had two choices: run and try to rebuild a normal life, or fight back and expose what was happening, not just to me, but to others like me. As I sat there, the folder on the passenger seat seemed to pulse with weight. Inside were names, documents, and evidence of the program's existence. It was dangerous to keep, but even more dangerous to destroy. This was my proof. I drove aimlessly for hours, the events of the night replaying in my head. The Harpers had lied to me, but they had also tried to protect me in their own misguided way. And now I understood why. They had been up against something far larger, far more powerful than I had imagined. But I wasn't going to let fear stop me. If I had survived their experiments, it meant I was stronger than they believed. And if I could survive, maybe I could help others do the same. The next day I made my decision. I wouldn't go back to the Harpers, not yet. I couldn't face their sorrow, their guilt, knowing what I now knew. Instead, I found a secluded motel off the highway and began poring through the folder. The names listed were all tied to small towns like Brookhaven, places where children could vanish without attracting much attention. The notes were detailed, with references to something called the Initiative. The deeper I dug, the more I realized how vast the operation was, and how many lives it had destroyed. By the time I finished, I had a plan. I would reach out to someone who could help. Journalists, investigators, anyone willing to uncover the truth. I didn't know if I could trust the authorities, but I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. If they were still running the program, I had to stop them. Before I left, I burned the copy of my name in the folder. Whatever happened next, I couldn't let them find me again. The fire consumed the page, the word unstable curling into ash. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if I'll be able to stop them or if they'll catch me before I get the chance. But I do know one thing. This isn't over. Not for me, and not for the others like me. What would you do if you discovered your entire life was a lie? Would you run or would you fight? Let me know in the comments. I could use all the advice I can get.